Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to explore a really fascinating tension that exists in the minds of ambitious learners everywhere. Today, we're looking at the absolutely crucial difference between genuinely building our intellect and simply engaging in wasted effort. We're going to fundamentally reevaluate our study habits using a deeply insightful reflection drawn directly from our source material. If you love to learn, you are definitely going to want to pay close attention to this one. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever poured your heart, your soul, and your time, maybe even an entire year, into mastering a task, working incredibly hard, only to wake up one day and realize it yielded absolutely zero practical results? Yeah, it's a painful realization. You thought you were being super productive, you felt like an intellectual, but in reality, you were just running on a treadmill. Today, we're going to dissect exactly how and why this happens. To really unpack this, we're drawing from a fantastic source. The text we're analyzing is based on a 2018 recording titled Spiritual Messages from Hamerton: Can an Intellectual Life Be Established Today? By Ryuho Okawa. In it, he looks back at his own university days and his encounter with a massive, highly influential classic book called The Intellectual Life, originally written by Philip Gilbert Hamerton. Through Okawa's personal experiences with this book, we get a literal masterclass in what true intellectualism actually looks like in practice. Here is our agenda for today. 1. What is modern intellectual life? 2. Hamerton and the British Empire. 3. Memories of empty exam prep. And 4. Towards practical intelligence. Let's get into it. Section 1. What is modern intellectual life? Defining the pursuit of knowledge today. To really understand the source material, we first have to understand the man who inspired it. Section 2. Hamerton and the British Empire. A historical perspective on the author's era. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the historical juxtaposition it creates. Hamerton was born in 1834. Now, this was the absolute peak of the British Empire, right? A time of immense national strength, global expansion, and just massive cultural confidence. To put this into a totally startling perspective for Japanese history, the legendary samurai Sakamoto Ryoma was born just a year and a half later, in January 1836. That was right at the dawn of the turbulent Bakumatsu era. Placing Hamerton right alongside the heroes of the Meiji Restoration gives us this immediate, visceral sense of historical scale. Hamerton's writings basically reflect the intellectual vigor of a superpower at its absolute zenith. Section 3. Memories of Empty Exam Prep. The Tensei Jingo Translation Grind. As a university student, Okawa picked up the incredibly thick, hardcover edition of Hamerton's The Intellectual Life. As you can probably imagine, engaging with a heavy philosophical text like this feels incredibly serious. It feels like this high-level intellectual pursuit. It took a significant amount of time just to read through the heavy, inspiring advice on how to live an intellectual life. But, as we'll see, feeling inspired by a book and applying intelligence practically are two very different things. And this leads us to the grind. Motivated to study at the highest possible level, Okawa engaged in an incredibly intense daily routine for his university exam preparation. Here was the process. Step 1, he would cut out the famous Tensei Jingo daily column from the Asahi Shimbun newspaper. Step 2, he'd paste it into a notebook and painstakingly translate that complex Japanese text into English, all by himself. Step 3, a day later, he would take the official English translated version published in the Asahi Evening News and use it to strictly correct his own work. And he did this meticulously. He filled an entire notebook over the course of a whole year. It sounds incredibly rigorous, right? Like the ultimate intellectual workout? Or, maybe a form of self-inflicted torture. But despite all that massive effort, here is Okawa's direct reflection on the experience. It didn't help with exams at all. In fact, it caused my grades to drop. No way, right? Why would that happen? Because that Tensei Jingo column discussed high-level political and economic commentary, topics that almost never actually appeared on the university entrance exams. He was studying something completely irrelevant to his actual practical goal. If he had just stuck to standard exam reference books, his grades absolutely would have gone up. Instead, he was overreaching. The realization was just crushing. He notes that doing this whole back-and-forth translation for a year made him feel like he was doing something incredibly sophisticated, but in reality it was just self-satisfaction. When he realized that literally none of this esoteric vocabulary was going to help him pass, he said, "It was a complete waste. I felt entirely empty." This perfectly captures the trap of illusionary intellectualism, doing something that looks and feels smart but completely lacks any practical utility for the task at hand. Section 4. Towards practical intelligence. shifting from illusion to impact. So the crucial point is, reflecting on this later, Okawa notes a really profound lesson, especially relevant to fields like publishing and editing. There is a stark difference between illusionary intellectualism, which is writing or studying self-satisfying, complex, needlessly difficult prose, and practical intellectualism. Practical intellectualism is the ability to write and communicate in a way that is widely read, easily understood, and highly praised by many people. The goal isn't to show off how smart you are, the goal is to create actual impact and value in the real world. This actually aligns perfectly with what Hamerton himself preached. Hamerton pointed out that to continuously produce good books or great art, you cannot just rely on sudden bursts of genius. Continuous effort is absolutely required. The steady accumulation of knowledge and materials is essential, and, most importantly, inspiration is not enough on its own. People love the idea of the inspired genius, but Hamerton argues that without the disciplined, steady accumulation of foundational skills, without continuous effort, inspiration alone will get you nowhere. Furthermore, when we consume information, we often focus on the completely wrong metric. We obsess over reading speed, but the source material highlights another golden rule from Hamerton. In reading, selection is far more important than speed. It's not about how fast you can process everything. It's about having the discernment to know what not to read. Cutting out the noise, the irrelevant stuff, and the unhelpful data, just like cutting out the wrong study materials for an exam, is the true mark of a refined, practical intellect. Which brings us to our final question for you today. Take a look at your own habits. In your modern life, with all your reading, your studying, and your work, are you actually building practical wisdom that moves the needle? Or are you just endlessly translating your own tensei jingo? Are you engaged in a complex, exhausting task that looks really smart, but is ultimately a waste of your valuable time? Take a step back this week. Look at where your effort is going and make sure you are chasing impact, not just the illusion of it. Because the hardest work in the world means nothing if you're running in the wrong direction. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, but more importantly, keep focusing on what truly matters.
Welcome to this explainer. We are jumping right into a topic today that affects every single one of us, whether we want to admit it or not. We're going to explore the gritty reality of intellectual stamina. Basically, we're peeling back the curtain on why relying purely on your natural talent or, the smarts you had back in high school or college is actually a one-way ticket to cognitive decay. We so often look at brilliant creators, successful professionals, or prolific writers, and we just assume they have a gift. But the source material we're digging into today absolutely shatters that illusion. We're looking at the hidden engine of genius, and more importantly, how to prevent your own mind from rusting away.
It's a pretty terrifying question to ask ourselves, isn't it? Is your brain starting to rust? When we look at the insights of P.G. Hamerton, a highly prominent British writer and thinker, he issues an incredibly stark warning. He argues that without continuous, deliberate intellectual training, our minds don't just stay stagnant, they actively and rapidly begin to rust and deteriorate. Think of your brain like a high-performance sports car. You can't just leave it parked in the garage for a decade and expect it to start perfectly on the first try, right? The gears lock up, the metal degrades. While Hamerton argues that our intellect operates under the exact same unyielding laws of maintenance.
The reality here is brutally honest. As Hamerton points out, even if you were smart in your youth, if you do not make an effort, you will begin to deteriorate. If your brain rusts, it becomes useless. What this means is that your past academic achievements, those straight A's, that prestigious degree you earned, they mean absolutely nothing in the present if you abandon the daily habit of learning. It is so incredibly common for people who are brilliant in their youth to just coast on those past glories. But this intellectual rust, it's silent, it's fast, and it will quickly destroy your cognitive edge if you let your guard down for too long.
Which brings us to phase 1, the terror of mental rust.
Resting on your laurels is quite literally the most dangerous thing an adult professional can do. Because think about it, once you enter the working world, that structured curriculum of school totally disappears. No one is forcing you to read, to analyze things, or to stretch your cognitive boundaries anymore. And this is exactly where the rust sets in for the vast majority of people. They confuse doing their job with intellectual growth. But simply repeating the same professional tasks day in and day out, that doesn't sharpen the blade, it just wears it down. The crucial antidote to this decay is what Hamerton calls intellectual training. Notice the word training there. It implies a workout, it implies sweat. Intellectual training is the continuous, daily effort of acquiring knowledge that is absolutely required in adulthood to prevent the mind from deteriorating. It proves that maintaining your mental sharpness isn't about luck, and it's definitely not passive. It's about relentless, deliberate conditioning. You have to actively choose to read challenging materials and push your boundaries every single day. Let's move right along to phase 2. Effort and accumulation are absolute.
Producing high-quality work or maintaining a high level of output in any field demands so much more than just sitting around waiting for a magical muse. We all love that romanticized idea of the genius who just gets struck by lightning and produces a masterpiece in a single sitting, right? But the reality is that continuous effort and the steady accumulation of knowledge are absolute non-negotiable requirements. You simply cannot output what you have not inputted. Take Hamerton himself. Before he was a highly respected author, he actually started his career as a painter, capturing landscapes in France. But as he transitioned from painting into writing, he discovered firsthand that you cannot just wing it. He realized that writing good books and sustaining that output over a lifetime requires the absolute conditions of continuous effort and massive knowledge accumulation. It wasn't enough to just have a good idea once. He needed a vast, overflowing reservoir of study to draw from continuously.
So this brings us to a massive paradigm shift. We have to completely reframe our understanding of how creativity and genius actually function. The amateur's view is that you just sit around waiting for inspiration to strike randomly from the heavens. But the professional's reality, entirely different. According to the text, inspiration and daily intellectual effort are in a strict sister relationship. They are directly proportional. Inspiration isn't some random lightning bolt from a clear sky. It is the spark that naturally ignites when you have diligently gathered enough dry kindling. If you don't read, if you don't put in that unseen hard work, the inspiration simply will not come.
If that sounds a bit abstract, let's jump into phase 3, the overwhelming effort of greats.
Let's look at the concrete, almost unbelievable habits of some of history's greatest creators to see what this true effort actually looks like in the real world. Because when we talk about accumulation and training, we're not just talking about casually reading a paperback before bed. The people who leave a mark on history operate on a completely different scale of input. Consider the world-famous author Walter Scott. He's legendary for historical epics like Ivanhoe. But his intellectual effort wasn't just sitting at a desk imagining things. His research involved amassing staggering, massive libraries. He would literally wait at the docks for ships to arrive with huge stacks of newly published books from foreign countries. And he didn't even stop at books. He collected actual historical weapons and armor just to feel them, to understand the weight of them, all to fuel the absolute authenticity of his writing. That is the sheer scale of physical and intellectual accumulation required for true greatness.
Or take the legendary Japanese historical novelist Ryotaro Shiba. His method was equally, if not more intense. When he researched a topic, he didn't just buy a few reference books. He famously bought literal truckloads of documents and historical records. Truckloads! He would read so exhaustively, absorbing so much context and granular detail, that he described reaching a state where the very words seemed to literally stand up off the page for him. He read until the history wasn't abstract anymore, but a vivid, living reality in his mind. That level of intense, obsessive immersion is the hidden foundation of his brilliant storytelling.
And that brings us to our final section, Phase 4, the water bird struggling underwater. Everything we've discussed so far completely shatters the illusion of the effortless genius. When we consume a great book, a flawless presentation, or a brilliant piece of art, we are only looking at the final, polished product. We are totally blind to the mechanics of how it was actually created. The intellectual Shoichi Watanabe brilliantly captures this dynamic with his famous water bird metaphor. Picture a beautiful swan or a water bird in a pond. When you look at it from the shore, it appears to be gliding smoothly, elegantly, and completely effortlessly across the surface of the water. There is zero visible struggle. But, as Watanabe points out, this perfectly illustrates the massive dichotomy between a creator's visible masterpiece and their invisible reality.
Because right beneath the surface of that water, totally out of sight, that bird is paddling frantically. As the quote goes, everyone only sees the smooth swimming on the surface, but the reality is the tremendous effort happening beneath the water. The genius we admire, the elegant prose, the sharp insights, the perfect execution, that is merely the surface of the water. The true engine of their inspiration, the thing actually propelling them forward, is that desperate, continuous, exhausting paddling hidden entirely from view. It's the truckloads of books, the relentless reading, the daily fight against mental rust.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, the ultimate choice sits squarely on your shoulders. The science of intellectual stamina is crystal clear. Inspiration and effort are sisters, and without daily training, your mind is going to deteriorate. Are you going to rely on fading past glories and the smarts of your youth until your brain completely rusts away into uselessness? Or will you embrace the hidden engine of effort, pick up a challenging book today, and start frantically paddling beneath the surface? The water's waiting. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to dive into a powerful historical philosophy on how to protect your mental energy in an age of constant information overload. We are going to explore a completely different paradigm for managing your time, your focus, and ultimately, your intellectual output.
So let's just start by confronting a feeling I'm pretty sure we all share. We live in this era where we are constantly told to consume more, right? More articles, more books, more data. But let me ask you, is your desire to know everything actually making you less intellectual? I mean, we often feel this tremendous guilt for not being able to do it all. We buy giant stacks of books we never even open, and we bookmark hundreds of articles we are absolutely never going to read. Today, we're going to look at why that instinct to just consume more is fundamentally flawed and exactly how to fix it.
To figure out how to break this cycle, we're pulling from a really fascinating source. We are exploring the deep historical wisdom of Philip Gilbert Hamerton. He was a 19th century British intellectual and writer. Through a modern spiritual lens presented in this book by Ryuho Okawa, we get an incredible look at how Hamerton's philosophy of the intellectual life can survive today's endless modern distractions. It is a striking look at how practitioners across history intensely protected their own minds.
All right, Section 1, the art of letting go. This brings us to a massive shift in mindset. We need to move away from the exhausting pressure of addition, adding more tasks, more reading, more obligations, and move toward the incredibly liberating power of subtraction. At the core of this is the Japanese concept of mikiru. In our source text, it represents the wisdom of decisively judging, abandoning, or just ruthlessly cutting out waste from your life. And to be clear, this is not about giving up because you're lazy, it's the exact opposite. Giving up the unnecessary is the ultimate form of intellectual self-defense. Actually, scratch that. It's an active, aggressive choice to protect your mental bandwidth.
The crucial point here is that cutting out waste is absolutely essential to get an intellectual life on track today. Just think about it for a second. Hamerton was writing way back in the 19th century, but his wisdom is arguably more vital right now than it ever was. We are basically swimming in a bottomless ocean of digital information and superficial chores. If you don't actively practice mikikuru, if you don't ruthlessly cut the fat, your intellectual life will literally just drown. Cutting the waste is how you safeguard your personal intellectual resources for what truly matters.
Moving right along to Section 2. Stop speed reading now.
Let's apply this concept of mikuru to a modern habit we all feel a little guilty about, how we consume information. The modern instinct when we're faced with way too much data is to just try and process it faster. We take speed reading courses, we listen to podcasts at double speed, you name it. But Hamerton's historical philosophy argues something entirely different. True intellectual selection is not about speed at all. It's about selective reading. It's about quickly judging what has absolutely no value to your specific goals, and then just skipping it entirely.
The text highlights a really profound realization. Rather than obsessing over the mere speed of your reading, the true essential skill is the quickness of your judgment. It is vastly more important to have the courage to simply say, "Nope, this is unnecessary," and decide not to read it. Being quick to abandon a valueless book is a much, much higher intellectual skill than just forcing yourself to read a bad book quickly.
Let's look at how this builds into a broader rule. Unnecessary reading wastes precious intellectual energy. Think of your brain like a battery. Every single time you force yourself to finish an article or a book out of sheer obligation, you are draining that battery. Cutting out invaluable reading protects your mind. It reserves your very limited daily energy for the knowledge and the deep work that actually aligns with your life's purpose.
Okay, let's get into Section 3, choosing an intellectual partner. Now we are moving to a highly provocative but super practical application of mikuru. In a section exploring the wisdom of practitioners transcending history, we find Hamerton's incredibly stark historical views on marriage. The source notes that for someone actively pursuing a life of the mind, staying single was historically often seen as highly advantageous, simply to protect one's time. But if an intellectual does choose to marry, Hamerton believed there were very strict conditions for that relationship to actually succeed without totally destroying their intellectual pursuits. According to this historical perspective, there are really only two types of successful spouses for a truly dedicated intellectual. The first is the absolute caretaker. This is a partner who takes on all household chores without making the intellectual feel hesitant or guilty for their intense focus. The second type is the intellectual equal. This is a partner fully capable of walking the steep, rugged path of knowledge right alongside you,
acting as a true peer and conversational equal. It's a pretty ruthless, highly categorized view of relationships, for sure, but it perfectly highlights the absolute lengths to which historical practitioners went to safeguard their mental environment.
The text openly acknowledges just how incredibly hard it is to maintain this balance. Navigating public duties, family relationships, and deep intellectual work is a massive, massive challenge. Choosing a partner is perhaps the most critical, life-altering decision you will ever make regarding your intellectual resources. A mismatch here, according to the source, can drain your energy faster than anything else, leaving absolutely nothing left for your true work.
Which brings us to our final part. Section 4, protecting your mental energy. Let's bring all these concepts together. The timeless wisdom of intellectual practitioners transcending history really all points to the exact same truth. Whether it is abandoning a useless book, walking away from a distraction, or carefully navigating your most personal relationships, this historical wisdom boils down to one single overriding priority: fiercely guarding your time.
So the crucial takeaway for us today is that true wisdom isn't about processing more data. We need a massive paradigm shift from addition to subtraction. When you finally embrace the power of Misakiru, when you realize that saying no to a book, a task, or a social obligation is actually a massive victory for your intellect, you experience this immense sense of relief. Letting go of the unnecessary is exactly how you make room for brilliance.
I want to leave you with a direct challenge based on everything we've just covered. I want you to look at your desk right now. Look at your digital schedule and look closely at your daily habits. What is the very first thing you need to decisively cut out today? Don't try to speed raid through the noise. Cut the noise out entirely. Reclaim your mental energy and start building a true intellectual life. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I highly encourage you to take that first step of subtraction today.
Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. You know, we live in this era of just unprecedented connectivity, right? Yet so many of us end our days feeling incredibly mentally exhausted and, honestly, intellectually unfulfilled. You might literally be sitting there right now feeling the heavy weight of constant notifications, unread articles, and just this endless nonstop stream of updates. It feels like we're always busy, always consuming, but are we actually learning anything of substance? Well, today we're going to unpack how to stop wasting your finite, precious time on Earth and finally reclaim a deeper, more meaningful intellectual life. We're going to explore exactly why we fall into this modern trap, and more importantly, how we can systematically rebuild a life focused on genuine wisdom rather than just fleeting data. Let's dive right in.
So ask yourself honestly right now, are the endless feeds on your smartphone actually making you wiser, or are you just blindly processing data? Think about the literal physical act of scrolling. Your thumb swipes up, your eyes scan a flashy headline, your brain gets this tiny, fleeting hit of dopamine, and then poof, it's gone. Instantly replaced by the next image, the next outrage, the next crazy trend. We spend hours trapped in this loop. The real danger here is that we mistakenly confuse this constant neurological buzz for actual learning. We confuse feeling overstimulated with the quiet, profound process of actually becoming educated. We're processing gigabytes of data every single day, but at the end of the day, there's often just this profound emptiness where real understanding should be.
To find a way out of this whole modern dilemma, we're going to look at the brilliant insights of Philip Gilbert Hamerton. Now, what's absolutely fascinating here is that Hamerton was a 19th century thinker. He was writing way, way before the internet or smartphones were even a thought. Yet, his philosophies on the intellectual life serve as the absolute perfect diagnosis for our modern screen-addicted reality. It's kind of wild, right? A guy from the 1800s literally holds the precise cure for our digital age. By applying his timeless principles to our current setup, we're challenged to look really critically at our own habits, to physically put down the glowing device, and to consciously pick up the pursuit of true wisdom.
Section 1. The Modern Information Trap, Digital Fatigue, and the Illusion of Learning.
Hamerton hits the nail on the head here. Modern society has suffered this massive collective cognitive failure. We have completely lost the ability to distinguish between universal knowledge and just fleeting information. Think about it. Everything we consume today is delivered through the exact same medium, a glowing rectangular screen. Because it all looks identical, our brains are tricked into assigning the exact same cognitive weight to a random, unverified social media post as we would to a profound chapter from a classic novel. It just all blurs together into one overwhelming stream designed purely for rapid consumption. We read a tweet, we read a philosophical essay, and we swipe past both with the exact same speed.
When information and knowledge become indistinguishable, we completely lose our anchor to the truth.
And this massive waste of time isn't just limited to doom scrolling. It extends to how we structure our lives and even how we approach education. Constantly consuming daily news, weekly magazines, and trending topics puts us in this endless media cycle designed for instant consumption. But Hamerton warns us about another side of this trap, wasting immense amounts of time and money on superficial education. Think about modern cram schools, expensive tutoring, or quick-fix courses that promise lightning-fast results but completely fail to build a foundational intellect. It's the ultimate illusion of productivity. We pack our schedules with these supplementary classes and endless articles, acting like we're enriching ourselves. But in reality, it's literally like eating empty calories. You feel full for a fleeting second, but you're actually starving your mind of true nourishment.
Picture a typical morning commute. You're on the train or the bus, your head is down, and you are frantically reading the latest political drama or scrolling through social media. By the time you even arrive at the office, you are mentally exhausted before the workday has even started. This is the brutal exhaustion of chasing temporary trends. There is a very specific, profound futility in dedicating immense blocks of your finite life to consuming news that comes with a strict one-year expiration date. Think about it. Almost everything trending today will be completely irrelevant, forgotten, and utterly valueless in 12 months' time. Running on this endless digital treadmill just leaves you drained, anxious, and burdened with a lingering sense of emptiness.
Section 2. Knowledge versus information. What are you actually feeding your mind?
The dichotomy on this slide is stark, and honestly, it's absolutely essential to understand. On one side, we have temporary, easily consumed information. Your social media updates, celebrity gossip, the daily news cycles. This content is explicitly designed to expire. It has a one-year expiration date at best, and after that, it offers absolutely zero value to your life. On the other side, we have universal knowledge, the classics, timeless wisdom, and foundational truths that have guided humanity for centuries. Consuming things that expire so quickly leaves your mind severely malnourished. Sure, accessing cheap, fast information has become incredibly convenient today, but we must aggressively defend our minds. We cannot let this digital junk food replace our pursuit of things that have lasting universal value.
The really profound danger of having such cheap, limitless access to data is that we trick ourselves into believing we're actually learning. But in reality, we are merely becoming masters of information processing. We become highly efficient at sorting, skimming, categorizing, and then immediately forgetting everything. We're acting like human Wi-Fi routers, mindlessly passing packets of data right through our brains without ever allowing a single profound thought to actually take root. We are basically sorting data for a living rather than building an intellectual foundation. So you really have to ask yourself a tough question here. Are you elevating your intellect to become a giant in your field, or have you just trained yourself to be an exceptionally fast scroller? Section 3. The Ultimate Time Saver. The Counterintuitive Power of the Classics.
You know the most common complaint in the modern era, right? I just do not have time to read. We feel so starved for time. Yet, it is incredibly counterintuitive to realize that figuring out which books are truly good is actually the absolute greatest way to save your life's finite time. Reading a good book is a time saver precisely because it actively prevents you from squandering hundreds of hours on low-value, fleeting content. Dedicating yourself to a proven, profound text is infinitely more efficient than skimming 1,000 mediocre articles that you're going to forget by tomorrow anyway. Choosing the right book acts as a shield, completely protecting your most valuable asset, your time, from the relentless noise of the modern world.
So how do you actually know if a book is truly good? Well, classics and great books are simply those that have survived the rigorous, absolutely brutal test of time. New does not automatically mean good, and trending for sure doesn't mean valuable. When you pick up a classic, you're essentially crowdsourcing history. Generations of readers before you have already done the incredibly hard work of filtering out the mediocre, the inaccurate, and the trivial stuff. They are handing you only the purest, most refined insights humanity has ever produced. By leaning on the test of time, you completely bypass the noise and guarantee that the time you spend reading will provide deep, enduring value. Think about this for a second. There was a time when buying a new book meant you actually had to physically use a paper knife to carefully cut open the uncut pages as you read them. That tactile, deliberate friction, the literal effort required just to access the words, was a profound experience.
Modern society has completely lost this luxurious joy of effort. We have traded the deep, immersive happiness of engaging with a great work for the frictionless, sterile, and ultimately joyless infinite scroll of a smartphone. True joy and happiness, they don't come from merely grazing the surface of flowing information. They come from the deliberate, luxurious effort of deeply immersing yourself in universal knowledge.
Section 4. Towards information decluttering, reclaiming your time and mind. Okay, so to actually step out of this information trap, you have to develop a ruthless power to cut things away. And I don't just mean a gentle decluttering. This has to be an active, aggressive defense of your intellect. You must sever ties with useless media, superficial cram schools, and those trivial trends that do nothing but drain your time and money. Seriously, stop chasing news that comes with a one-year expiration date. Purposefully seek out universal truths over daily data. Now, I won't lie, it requires a tremendous amount of willpower to reject the easy, frictionless dopamine of a smartphone and instead embrace the intentional, sometimes difficult effort required for deep reading. But cultivating this exact power to cut away the unnecessary, it is the only way to protect your mind and reclaim your life.
The choice between fleeting information and a true intellectual life is entirely in your hands. Right in this very moment, you have the power to cut away the noise. So the crucial question I'm leaving you with today is this. When this explainer ends in just a few seconds, what are you going to do? Will you automatically open another app and begin an endless, empty scroll? Or will you put the device down, embrace the luxurious joy of effort, and seek out a timeless book? Thanks so much for joining me today, and I sincerely hope you choose to reclaim your time.
Welcome back to another explainer. Today, we're diving into a really profound paradigm shift. It's all about how we think about, consume, and actually value knowledge. You know that feeling when you've been scrolling endlessly, but you somehow feel like you haven't actually learned anything of real value? Yeah, you're definitely not alone. We're going to explore a text that totally deconstructs this illusion of modern knowledge. It's going to show us what it really takes to move from just gathering random information to forging genuine, deep intellect.
Okay, let's dive into this. The catalyst for our discussion today is Ryuho Okawa's book, Hamerton's Spiritual Messages. And I want you to notice this provocative little sticker right on the front cover. It literally just says, "Put down your smartphone, let's read a book." I mean, it's a bold demand, right? Especially in an era where our entire lives, our work, our friends, and, let's be honest, those 2 a.m. doom scrolling sessions are completely filtered through these glowing rectangles in our pockets. Right off the bat, the text is challenging us to completely reevaluate our primary medium for learning. So, what does this all mean? Well, it brings up a rather uncomfortable question that the book asks us to confront. Is our daily smartphone scrolling actually making us smarter, or is it literally just eroding our willpower? The author points out that modern society has this tendency to mistake rapid information processing for genuine intelligence. We skim a headline, we read a quick bulleted summary, and bam, we feel informed. But the text asks a critical question. Are we actually getting any real intellectual nutrition here, or are we just gorging on empty calories?
Section 1. Breaking free from passive smartphones.
Now, you might hear a common counter-argument here. Look, data is data, whether it's on a screen or a printed page. But Chapter 5 of the text argues that this mindset misses the entire point. It's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. On one side, you have passive information gathering via smartphones. It's effortless, it's easily digestible, but on the other side is active knowledge forging. And here is the kicker. The physical and mental struggle of reading a difficult book, of actually sitting with a complex idea without just swiping away to something more entertaining, well, the author says that struggle is exactly where the true value lies.
Section 2. Forging the Willpower of Greatness.
Now, what's really interesting about this is on page 78, where the text outlines a super profound point. The hidden value of reading a book isn't just about the data you extract from it, it's about the effort you put in. Chewing through tough, uncompromising material is literally described as resistance training for your mind. Think of it like a giant mental gym. Just as lifting a heavy weight breaks down your muscles to build them back stronger, wrestling with a dense book builds up the mental muscles you absolutely need for complex thought.
The author summarizes this perfectly, saying, the difference lies in the strong willpower required to read a book through to the end. And this is absolutely crucial. Unlike a smartphone, which is just constantly feeding you these immediate dopamine hits, a difficult book offers basically zero instant gratification. None. The argument here is that by forcing yourself to read through to the very last page, you are actively training the exact kind of willpower that effortless scrolling destroys. And this brilliantly illustrates a distinct cause and effect chain presented in the book. Step 1, you read difficult books to the very end.
Step 2. Through that struggle, you build strong, undeniable willpower. Step 3 involves translating that willpower into actual grit for the heavy, life-altering decisions you have to make in the real world. And finally, Step 4. This sustained mental fortitude actually develops the power to become what the text calls a great person, or akin in Japanese. It's a really powerful argument that your character, not just the facts you've memorized, is what ultimately forges historical greatness.
Section 3. Ostrich and Eagle, Two Types of Knowledge.
Moving on to page 83, the text introduces this incredibly powerful metaphor. Here, Professor Shoichi Watanabe expands on Hamerton's original thoughts, pointing out that we modern folks often confuse two very different types of knowledge. He separates these out into intellect, and he uses this incredibly vivid imagery of two totally distinct birds to explain it.
Let's break this down, because Watanabe contrasts these two concepts really sharply. On the left, we have intelligence, which is symbolized by the ostrich. Its focus is entirely on grounded reality processing. Its strength is in passing exams, doing paperwork, and making really fast, immediate decisions. But on the right, we have intellect, symbolized by the eagle. Instead of running on the ground, the eagle takes a deliberate, overarching bird's-eye view, prioritizing long-term vision and philosophical depth. The text argues that modern society completely rewards the ostrich, but true vision, that requires the eagle.
So, the crucial point is understanding what it means to operate with ostrich intelligence. It means keeping your feet firmly planted on the ground and running incredibly fast. In human terms, this is the person who aces every competitive exam, instantly clears out their inbox, and efficiently handles worldly admin tasks. And the author absolutely acknowledges that this is a highly necessary skill. But, and here's the catch, if you are purely an ostrich, your head literally never leaves the dirt. You remain completely bound by immediate, practical tasks.
Eagle intellect, on the other hand, takes a completely visionary perspective. It lifts you high above those mundane daily admin tasks, so you can actually grasp overarching truths and historical context. The text notes that this is the kind of philosophical perspective required of kings, queens, and true leaders. They have to look down from a massive height to see the whole board, not just the piece right in front of them.
Section 4. Cultivating True Intellectual Values. So, the author offers a really sharp critique of our current systems here, arguing that modern education basically acts as a massive training facility for great ostriches, while completely forgetting how to raise eagles. By hyper-focusing on competitive exam skills and rote memorization, our schools are teaching intelligence for sure, but they are entirely failing to cultivate true intellect.
Let's move to page 86 and see how this builds, because the author points out a pretty hard truth. You cannot just package true intellect into a standard school curriculum. There's no way. You can't just memorize your way into becoming an eagle. True intellectualism requires something so much deeper than just getting a passing grade on a multiple-choice test.
As the text brilliantly states, intellectualism isn't just taught in schools, it's learned through the experience of a truly intellectual life. Let that sink in. The book suggests this literally means putting down the smartphone, picking up difficult material, and voluntarily engaging in the struggle of higher-order thinking. It's an active, deliberate choice to cultivate philosophical values, rather than just passively accepting whatever reality is handed to you by a screen.
And this leaves us with the ultimate choice presented by the text. We can opt for the easy, passive flow of digital information, keeping our heads down and processing reality as fast as we possibly can. Or we can embrace the deliberate effort of forging true willpower and a higher-order perspective. The book leaves us with a provocative question to chew on. Starting tomorrow, will you run like an ostrich or will you soar like an eagle? Thanks so much for watching this explainer, and we will catch you next time. Welcome to today's explainer. We are diving right into a really profound philosophical shift in how we actually view intellectualism and success. We're going to unpack some incredibly insightful text that completely challenges the conventional wisdom of what it actually means to be, quote-unquote, smart. Honestly, if you've ever looked at how society defines intelligence and thought, something is definitely missing here, you are going to find this incredibly validating. So, let's get right into it.
Let's kick things off with a question you've probably asked yourself at some point. Maybe after a long day dealing with a particularly frustrating boss. Why do smart people sometimes make the absolute worst leaders? Think about it for a second. We literally all know someone who was a straight-A student, brilliantly fast at processing information, yet the second they were put in charge of a team, they created a completely toxic environment or just drove the project straight into the ground. Why doesn't society's brightest talent always translate into the best leadership? Well, that exact question sets up the core critique of modern education that we'll be exploring today.
Section 1. Modern Smart Egoists. The Trap of Self-Serving Intelligence.
To really understand this trap, we have to look directly at Chapter 6 of our source material. Now, the author totally acknowledges that intellectual diligence, having patience, and achieving high work performance, these are, of course, excellent traits. People absolutely achieve greatness through hard work, but here is where the text makes a really vital pivot. It argues that those traits are simply not the ultimate goal. There is a much higher level of intellectual life that we've got to strive for. If you just stop at being a hard worker with great grades, you completely fall short of true leadership.
The real danger happens when someone studies and works solely for their own personal benefit. Think about what happens when people study just to get the best grades, to crush the competition on exams, and to secure a massive income just for themselves. They start to view those achievements as exclusive privileges. Basically, they use their intellect as a weapon to kick others down and secure their own elite status. The text identifies this smart egoist not just as a minor character flaw, but as a literal modern evil. It's basically intelligence completely stripped of empathy.
Section 2. From intelligence to true intellect, breaking through the ceiling.
The source material makes a razor-sharp distinction between being merely intelligent, which, let's be honest, is what our school systems usually measure, and possessing true intellect. On one side, you have the intelligent person. They're incredibly fast at processing, great at passing exams, super efficient, but ultimately, they're self-serving. They just learned the tricks to get ahead. But on the other side, we have the true intellectual. This is someone who engages in big-picture thinking, they're fair, they're altruistic, and they possess a deep, deep wisdom that goes way beyond anything you can find in a textbook. The argument here is that while being intelligent might get you promoted at first, being an intellectual is what actually makes you a true leader.
And that ego-driven learning we just talked about, it has some really severe limits. First off, it drives self-preservation above all else. Second, it causes massive friction in any competitive environment because the egoist is literally always trying to eliminate their rivals instead of collaborating with them. And finally, and this is the most critical part, when these individuals inevitably reach leadership roles, their inherent lack of care for other people renders them completely incapable of effective leadership. They just look out for number one, and they cause incredible organizational harm along the way.
Section 3. The crucial importance of fairness, the ultimate solution for leaders.
So if ego and self-preservation are the disease, the cure proposed by the text is reaching an elevated state of fairness and impartiality. Now, in this context, fairness isn't just about following the rules of some game. It is a profound philosophical state. It means actively looking way beyond your own self-interest so you can impartially care for and elevate others from a higher, broader perspective. And the text emphasizes a super important detail here. This has to be a conscious pursuit. You have to actively seek this mindset out. It doesn't just magically happen as you get older or get a fancier job title. You actually have to want to be fair.
Listen to this incredibly powerful mandate directly from the source. It says, you must look at people from a broader, higher perspective and care for them with fairness and impartiality. This takes that abstract philosophical concept and grounds it perfectly in a practical, everyday leadership application. Because as a true leader, you aren't in the trenches fighting for your own survival anymore. You are up on a balcony. You're looking down at the entire system, making sure everyone is cared for equitably.
The author is essentially arguing that those who are intellectually superior actually carry a moral duty. If you've been gifted with a really sharp mind, or if you've just worked incredibly hard to achieve academic success, your duty is to guide others without causing harm. True intellectuals just don't engage in petty battles. They don't try to shove other people off the ladder. Instead, they act impartially from that high vantage point we were just talking about. They ensure that their intellect is a rising tide that lifts all boats.
Section 4. The ideals leaders must possess, completing the transformation. To actually complete this transformation from a self-serving individual into a true, impactful leader, the text outlines what we can essentially call the 3 pillars of true intellect. Number 1 is an altruistic heart, meaning the genuine, actual desire to benefit other people. Number 2 is a strong public spirit. That means understanding that you're part of a much wider community and choosing to act in its best interest. And number 3, high ideals. You have to have a vision that goes way beyond next quarter's profit margins or your next big promotion. Cultivating these 3 pillars completely elevates the very act of studying and learning. It shifts it from a selfish pursuit into this incredibly powerful tool for widespread societal benefit.
When we zoom out and look at the real-world application of these pillars, the stakes become crystal clear.
True leadership doesn't just exist to make a single company more profitable. It relies on a fair heart to actually develop the organization, the country, and really, democratic society as a whole. The source material argues that it's exactly this specific shift in mindset, from selfish intelligence over to impartial intellect, that truly drives human and national progress. Because without it, we just have a bunch of really clever people fighting each other in the mud.
We all spend time learning, studying, and trying our absolute best to improve ourselves. But as we've seen today, the ultimate goal isn't just to be the smartest person in the room. The real question you have to ask yourself is this: beyond acquiring knowledge, who will you use that power for? Are you going to be a smart egoist, or will you pursue true intellect and fairness? Take that perspective with you into your work this week, and as always, keep learning.
So you love to dive deep into study. If that sounds like you, you've probably felt a really profound paradox at the very heart of your learning journey. It's this constant pulling tension between wanting to just lock yourself away in a room with your books and the deeply ingrained human need for actual connection. Today, in our explainer of the source material, we are exploring the very delicate balance required for a truly intellectual and spiritual life. We're going to talk about how to cultivate your mind without losing your soul, your friends, or your grounding in everyday reality.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll be covering 1. The inevitability of solitary time. 2. The danger of excessive isolation. 3. The indispensability of companions. 4. The dual nature of wealth and poverty. And finally, 5. Living on the royal road.
Section 1. The inevitability of solitary time.
To kick things off, let's acknowledge a basic truth about seeking an intellectual life. It inherently requires a certain degree of profound loneliness. And honestly, you probably crave that quiet, solitary study. Why? Because interacting with people from 2,000 years ago through texts is by definition a solitary time. Think about it. When you're reading in the dead of night, or maybe in the early hours of the morning, you actively have to step out of the current moment to grasp those universal truths. You simply cannot do deep, heavy cognitive work while you're constantly surrounded by the noise and chatter of the crowd. But here is the crucial takeaway. That solitude, it isn't actually empty. Not at all. When you sit down with really profound texts, you are communing with history's absolute greatest philosophical and spiritual figures. You're talking to the Buddha, to Socrates, to Jesus Christ, all from thousands of years ago. It's like you're standing in a crowded room of historical giants. And reaching that level of spiritual and intellectual engagement just requires you to temporarily isolate yourself from the immediate physical world around you.
Section 2. The danger of excessive isolation.
Okay, let's dive into this next part, because while solitude is absolutely the breeding ground for intellect, what happens when you completely sever your ties with the real world? Well, Chapter 7 of our source text highlights the incredibly difficult balance between intellectual life and human relations. The warning here is pretty stark. Absolute isolation can literally lead to a sick mind. If you find yourself entirely disconnected from the common sense of everyday society, you become incredibly vulnerable.
To explain this, the text introduces a really fascinating concept known as Jado-K, which translates to the evil path. It describes an abnormal state of mind caused by unchecked isolation. Think of a brilliant mind like a giant hot air balloon. Solitude and deep thought, that's the hot air that makes it rise beautifully into the sky. But human connection, that's your tether. Without that tether, the balloon just floats off unchecked into dangerous, unpredictable atmospheric conditions. In complete isolation, an intellectual might actually start receiving dangerous spiritual inspirations or fall into an abnormal mental state, mistaking pure madness for genius.
So, how on earth do you protect yourself from that? Your very first line of defense, your shield essentially, is a thoroughly trained brain, strong willpower, and a steady diet of substantial, mentally challenging books. Consistently reading profound literature builds up this incredible endurance and stability in your intellect. It acts like a filter against those bizarre or abnormal inspirations. But as you might guess, internal mental fortitude is really only half the battle.
Section 3. The indispensability of companions.
To truly thrive, the isolated intellectual requires a solid bridge back to everyday reality. If you look at the completely isolated solitary scholar, they are highly vulnerable to that evil path we just discussed. But the grounded intellectual, they do that exact same deep reading, but they stay tethered by what the text calls Dharma friends, intellectual peers who truly understand the specific path they are on. These friends actually protect the scholar through deep, stabilizing conversation. They keep each other balanced and grounded.
And the source text actually goes even further here, focusing really heavily on the home environment. It emphasizes a huge difference between being merely clever, having great grades or a bunch of academic degrees, and being truly wise. True wisdom in a partner is all about insight, capacity, and crucially, how they handle human relationships. It's about how they treat their parents, their coworkers, and, of course, their spouse.
In fact, the text explicitly notes that finding a life partner who fundamentally understands your intellectual pursuits is vital. An understanding spouse, one who can genuinely engage in deep conversation and completely comprehend the lonely nature of your work, serves as the ultimate comfort and grounding force. They are literally the strongest tether keeping that hot air balloon safely connected to Earth.
Section 4. The dual nature of wealth and poverty.
Now, what's really interesting about this next framework is how we apply this philosophy of balance to a very gritty material reality. I'm talking about money. Does wealth actually help or hinder the intellectual life? Well, the source reveals this brilliant matrix, showing that neither wealth nor poverty is inherently good or bad for the intellect. They both have right and wrong paths. Both circumstances have a royal road, which is a positive path of growth, and an evil road, a negative path of ruin. If you're wealthy, the royal road means using your money to buy time so you can study, travel, and deepen your culture. But if you aren't careful, that same wealth can quickly lead you down the evil road.
The text gives a super sharp example of this negative path. It talks about people with money or power who just become lazy. For instance, authoritarian figures who essentially just pay university professors to write their theses for them, just so they can publish it under their own names. That right there is the evil road of wealth. It's using your resources to fake intellectual achievement without ever actually doing the inner work. Ultimately, it just hollows out your mind.
On the flip side, poverty has its own royal road. The source shares this incredibly moving anecdote about a student or a young worker with barely any money to their name. They really want this sweater that costs 1,600 yen, but instead of buying it, they scrape that money together, completely sacrifice their own comfort, and buy a single profound book. And because that book cost them so dearly, they read it with fierce intensity. They absorb every single word. That restriction, that material hardship, actually creates a purer, far more focused intellectual experience.
Section 5. Living the Royal Road.
Whether you're navigating the lonely heights of ancient philosophy, searching for a partner who truly gets you, or just figuring out how to balance your budget for your next stack of books, walking this path takes immense, incredible dedication. But our source text offers this really beautiful encouragement. It says that when someone sacrifices their comfort, like giving up that 1,600 yen sweater just to grow their mind, the unseen forces of the heavenly realm look down, shed tears of joy, and cheer them on. Even when your intellectual journey feels isolating or demands strict material discipline, you are entirely supported by a higher spiritual reality as long as your motives are pure.
The mind absolutely needs to soar into solitude to learn, but it just as crucially must be anchored to reality through wise companions and balanced living. So, I want you to take a moment to reflect today. Who is the anchor for your intellectual journey? Is it a Dharma friend? Is it an understanding partner? Ensure your own hot air balloon is safely tethered. Keep learning, keep connecting, and I'll see you next time. In today's explainer, we're going to untangle a really fascinating paradox about the mind, art, and what it actually takes to create a masterpiece that truly stands the test of time. Let's dive right in. Have you ever heard the saying that too much thinking ruins creativity? We've all seen the Hollywood movie version of the tortured artist, right? You know, the creative genius who relies entirely on these spontaneous, uncontrollable bursts of raw emotion. It's a hugely popular trope, but it begs a really important question. Does intellectual training actually destroy artistic sensibility? I mean, does overthinking literally kill the creative spark? Well, according to the source material we're examining today, which draws heavily on the insights of Philip Gilbert Hamerton, a celebrated intellectual and former art magazine editor, the answer is a resounding no. Intellect doesn't kill art, it elevates it. Hamerton argues that a true aesthetic life demands rigorous intellectual effort, not just raw, unbridled emotion.
Let's unpack that, starting with Section 1, the myth of artistic genius.
There's this incredibly widespread misconception that pure, unfiltered inspiration is the absolute only fuel a creator needs. But a trap that highly sensitive people so often fall into is that when they reject intellectual discipline, when they rely entirely on fleeting feelings and just wait for that magical lightning bolt of inspiration to strike, they actually put themselves in a really vulnerable position. They become passive passengers to their own wildly unpredictable emotions.
This leads us right into Section 2,
Dangers of pure emotion.
So, what actually happens when left brain intellect, conscious structure, and organizational thought are just completely abandoned in the pursuit of art? Well, history shows us it's rarely a sustainable path. Our source text provides a very logical step-by-step breakdown of this descent. Step 1 is a disrupted life rhythm. Relying only on sporadic inspiration means working erratically, sleeping terribly, and losing all structure. And that leads directly to Step 2, highly erratic behavior. Eventually, without the grounding force of logic and discipline, this all culminates in Step 3, which is moral and character decay. The artist entirely loses their center.
This tragic trajectory leads to what the text calls the ruined type of artist. Now, these erratic creators might portray base, chaotic human desires in a way that gets them massive, temporary commercial success, but they ultimately fail to guide humanity toward anything higher. In fact, if they're just creating from a place of pure sensory madness, they often leave a negative long-term influence on society. They might look like brilliant romantic figures in the short term, but their legacy, it's ultimately destructive.
But there is a fix, which brings us to Section 3. Intellect elevates true beauty.
The definitive antidote to this ruin lies in left brain organization. Our sources highlight that continuous intellectual effort acts as a crucial framework. Think of it like scaffolding. It supports, organizes, and refines that raw, chaotic, artistic inspiration. Instead of destroying the sensitive spirit, intellectual discipline actually tempers and strengthens it. It allows the artist to reach for universal, heavenly beauty, rather than just sinking into the chaos of their own mind.
And this brings us to a really necessary moral checkpoint for any great creator. The text emphasizes that you absolutely must constantly question yourself. Is this right as a human being? Great art requires a high level of conscience. It requires you to consciously direct your work so it doesn't descend into madness or drag your audience down with it. You have to intellectually ask yourself if you're providing the right guidance through what you create.
Let's look at a concrete example. In Section 4, Picasso versus Phidias.
To really hammer this concept home, let's look at a powerful historical contrast presented in the text, starting with Pablo Picasso. Now, while he was undoubtedly a genius who had incredible traditional skills in his youth, the text uses Picasso as a prime example of a much more eccentric, purely sensory approach later in life. Some of his later, highly distorted works border on what the source describes as a sensory madness, leaving average observers completely confused, unable to discern if it's the work of a groundbreaking genius or someone who has simply lost their grip on reality. When we compare these two paths side by side, the contrast is stark. On the left, we have the sensory or eccentric approach, driven heavily by erratic emotions and often leading to a chaotic, unbalanced life. On the right, we have the intellectual, universal approach. This path is highly disciplined, morally grounded, and driven by high aspirations to present timeless, universal values to humanity. It's a path that requires immense mental fortitude.
So, let's move to the other side of that equation and see how this builds into something truly magnificent. We're taking a trip back to ancient Greece to meet Phidias, the master sculptor behind the incredible Parthenon. Phidias is presented in our sources as the absolute ultimate example of a highly disciplined, intellectually and morally driven artist. Which brings us to the climax of today's explainer in Section 5, True Art the Gods See.
There is a legendary story about Phidias that perfectly captures everything we've been talking about. When he was commissioned to create the magnificent statues for the Parthenon, they were designed to be placed incredibly high up on the temple walls. Because of this, no human eye would ever be able to see the backs of these figures once they were installed. Yet Phidias spent painstaking time, immense effort, and incredible skill carving the unseen backs of these statues just as beautifully and perfectly as the fronts. When the Athenian treasurer saw the bill, he was literally furious, refusing to pay for what he thought was completely useless, invisible work.
And here is Phidias's legendary, profound response to that treasurer: the gods are watching. He wasn't sculpting for the applause of the crowd, for fame, or for a quick commercial payout. He was guided by this unwavering internal discipline, a moral and intellectual commitment to absolute perfection, regardless of whether a human audience would ever actually validate his effort. So, the crucial takeaway here, the absolute core message of Hamerton's philosophy, is that true beauty, the kind that lasts for millennia and actually elevates the human spirit, is entirely supported by unseen effort. The hidden intellectual frameworks, the rigorous moral checkpoints, the quiet, disciplined hours of study and refinement, these are the invisible foundations that make a masterpiece truly eternal. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought.
In a world that so often rewards quick, dramatic emotional outbursts and highly visible, immediate success, true greatness demands a remarkably different path. It requires the intellect to temper and guide the emotion. So I want to ask you, even where no one is looking, what unseen efforts are you carving today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this insight helps you build a beautifully disciplined intellectual foundation for whatever you choose to create next.
Hey everyone, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking some really fascinating source material that completely rethinks modern success, specifically the intellectual lives of modern women. We're talking about looking beyond the usual corporate ladder and exploring a deeply rooted, ancient alternative to today's exhausting hustle culture.
So I want you to sit with this question for a second. We literally live in an era of nonstop hyper-competition, right? But our source material asks something pretty profound. In this relentless rush to succeed and constantly outdo each other, have we actually forgotten what it means to be truly wise? Is it possible we've traded deep, profound wisdom for, well, just short-term cleverness? Keep that distinction in the back of your mind, because it's absolutely the beating heart of everything we're looking at today.
Okay, let's jump into our first section, looking at the modern woman's struggle and the pressure of competing on historically male terms.
Our core source material for this is Ryuho Okawa's book, which features a spiritual message attributed to the 19th century essayist P.G. Hamerton. We're specifically zooming in on Chapter 9 here, and the text issues a really stark warning. It argues that women today are increasingly being pressured into what it calls a masculinized pursuit of worldly status. Basically, women are finding themselves fighting under the exact same secular, cutthroat, highly competitive conditions that were, historically speaking, established by men.
And the text observes that this is actually a massive trap, simply mimicking those male competitive behaviors, fighting tooth and nail for the exact same secular status and wealth. Well, it often just leads straight to spiritual burnout instead of any real, true fulfillment. The source makes the case that when success is defined solely by who can endure the most intense corporate battles or who can rake in the most cash, it forces people to completely neglect their inner lives. So for a lot of women aiming for this very specific conventional type of success, the end result isn't a feeling of profound accomplishment. It's actually a deep, heavy sense of spiritual exhaustion, which naturally makes you wonder, does the text offer us a completely different metric for a successful life?
Well, it turns out it does. That brings us to our next section, exploring the ancient contemplative life as a historically grounded alternative.
Far, far away from all the noise and stress of modern ambition, there's this concept of the contemplative life, or kanzetsu-teki seikatsu. And the text points out that in ancient traditions, this was actually highly valued as a profoundly superior career path. Think about that for a second. Instead of focusing outward on hoarding wealth or just completely crushing your competition, the contemplative life turns inward. The source describes it as an existence dedicated to deep meditation, to sensing the light of the divine, like gods or Buddhas, and pursuing pure academic and spiritual truth.
And what's really fascinating is that historically, this path wasn't seen as just retreating from the real world. Not at all. It was an active, highly respected choice. The source material roots this firmly in ancient Greek spiritual traditions and points to the historical roles of nuns, priestesses, or deeply dedicated female scholars. Back then, devoting your entire life to connecting with the divine, or just totally immersing yourself in deep academic study, well, it definitely wasn't seen as dropping out of the workforce. The text emphasizes that it was universally recognized as a profoundly legitimate career. It was an acknowledgement that pursuing spiritual truth is a massive, tangible contribution to society, totally separate from generating secular wealth.
This leads us right into our third section, looking at the core dichotomy of the text, the difference between being clever and being truly wise.
So here is the absolutely crucial point. There is this sharp contrast because modern society, as we know, often rewards being merely clever. But the source argues that real, lasting fulfillment requires the depth of being wise. Let's break this down a bit based on the text. The source uses the term clever to describe someone who is shrewd. You know the type, the person who knows exactly how to network, how to calculate every single relationship just for their own maximum personal gain. On the flip side, being wise means operating from a much deeper foundation of moral understanding. A wise person handles relationships not to see what they can extract from them, but with a public-spirited desire to actually contribute and genuinely understand other people.
In fact, the text specifically critiques this modern trend where highly educated individuals might use their perfect exam scores or their elite pedigrees as almost a weapon to look down on others. According to this framework, that is literally just being clever in the worldly sense. Okay, great, you figured out how to beat the academic system. But if that elite education doesn't translate into empathy, or into moral depth, or into a genuine desire to lift others up, well, the source concludes that you completely lack true wisdom.
So how do we actually bridge that gap? Let's move into our final section on cultivating true wisdom and elevating the modern career.
To transition into this new paradigm, the text argues that we have to actively polish 3 specific traits: a fair mind, a public spirit, and an altruistic heart. The source material is very explicit about this, actually. Fairness means dealing with literally everyone: your boss, your peers, your subordinates, your family, without any bias or selfish calculations. Public spirit means looking beyond your own cubicle or your own bank account and asking how your work is actually impacting the wider community. And altruism, that's the genuine desire to see other people succeed. These are presented as the absolute required daily practices for someone trying to shift from a merely clever life to a truly wise one.
The beauty of this is that by shifting your focus from pure self-interest to serving the greater good, you actually transform your daily grind into a modern contemplative practice. You absolutely do not have to quit your corporate job and move to a monastery to live this life. The source suggests that the modern equivalent of the ancient priestess or scholar is simply the professional who brings unshakable moral, religious, and altruistic values right into their everyday environment. Whether you are leading a massive boardroom meeting, just answering a mountain of emails, or managing a small team, doing so with fairness and a public spirit actually elevates that mundane work into a deeply spiritual and intellectual pursuit.
There's a quote from the text that perfectly captures the ultimate goal of Hamerton's message for modern professionals. You must step up from being just clever to becoming a truly wise human being. The source completely acknowledges that being clever, being shrewd, and figuring out how to navigate the secular world might just be required to survive in modern society today. But the text argues it absolutely should not be the end goal. The true intellectual life, the one that prevents burnout and provides real, lasting fulfillment, requires us to step up. The author is challenging us to evolve past that self-serving hustle and really embrace the profound depth of genuine wisdom.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final thought to reflect on, based on Hamerton's criteria for success. The source really challenges us to look in the mirror and ask, are our interactions purely transactional and clever? Or are we actively cultivating that contemplative, deeply moral wisdom that this ancient alternative describes? It is such a powerful lens through which the text asks us to view our daily lives, and it totally challenges our usual definition of success. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope it gave you a lot to think about.
Welcome back to the explainer. So today, we're diving into something that is just absolutely fascinating. I'm talking about a journey that spans literal millennia, connecting the jaw-dropping artistry of ancient Greece right up to the modern intellectual hustle we all deal with today. We're looking at some incredibly profound insights drawn from a spiritual dialogue involving Philip Gilbert Hamerton. Now, you might know him as the famous 19th century British essayist who wrote The Intellectual Life. But actually, we're not just dusting off his old books today. Oh no. We are getting into a deep, metaphysical look at his soul's entire lineage and what that actually means for how you and I train our minds right now. Get ready, because this is definitely going to challenge how you think about talent, hard work, and the unseen grind that really builds true intellect. But before we get completely lost in the history and the spiritual side of things, let me just ask you this straight up. Is there a magic spell to suddenly become a genius overnight? Right? Because we live in this world that is just obsessed with life hacks. We want the shortcuts, the 5-minute summaries, the secret formula to just instantly level up our careers and our brains. It's a super modern craving. We look at these brilliant artists or leaders, and a part of us is just hoping, praying that there's some hidden switch we can flip to get that same mastery without the sweat. Just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this, because as you'll see, the reality of real intellectual growth, it's way more demanding, but honestly, way more beautiful than any overnight magic trick. Okay, let's get into the thick of it. The source material we're breaking down today comes from a really unique spiritual interview. And the setup here is wild. We're not just reading what Hamerton wrote back in the day. The whole premise is a direct spiritual communication with him today. And here is the real kicker. During this conversation, it comes out that Hamerton's spirit is actually acting as the guardian spirit for one of the guys right there in the room asking the questions, a man named Tetsuhide Saito. Can you even imagine that? Sitting down to interview a historical figure and he just drops the bomb that he's the spiritual force guiding your life? This insanely intimate connection really sets the stage for a conversation that is deeply personal, surprisingly blunt, and just packed with insight about the mind. So as they're talking, we get this incredible look at the sheer timeline of this soul. Hamerton reveals his spiritual lineage, and it turns out he wasn't just a writer in the 1800s. His soul's journey goes way, way back. At one point, the famous management guru Peter Drucker gets brought up. Drucker actually highly praised a specific sculptor from the ancient world, and Hamerton confirms that in a past life he was that exact sculptor. It's such a wild crossover, right? A modern business icon praising ancient art. But it really points to this idea that true genius isn't just something you whip up in one lifetime. It's this massive accumulation of relentless effort across thousands of years. So who was this mystery sculptor? Well, Hamerton's past life was revealed to be none other than Phidias. We are talking about one of the absolute greatest sculptors of ancient Greece, right back in the 5th century BC. This guy was the mastermind overseeing the sculptures on the Parthenon in Athens. He built that mind-blowing 12-meter-tall statue of Athena made out of actual ivory and gold. This wasn't just a guy with a chisel, this was the visionary who literally defined what classical beauty was. When you realize that the soul of Phidias, the sculptor, eventually reincarnates as Hamerton, the intellectual thinker, the pieces really start coming together. The drive for absolute physical beauty and the drive for ultimate intellectual truth, they require the exact same kind of relentless, obsessive dedication. Now, there's this legendary story about Phidias that just hits the nail on the head when it comes to his philosophy. So he's carving these incredibly elaborate sculptures for the roof of the Parthenon, spending a fortune on materials and taking forever to carve the backs of these statues. And the Athenian treasury officials, they were absolutely furious. They actually refused to pay him full price. They were like, the backs of these statues are facing a wall. Literally no human being is ever going to see them. Why on earth did you waste time carving them? And Phidias just gives this totally legendary response. He says, "You are wrong. The gods are watching." I mean, wow. That just perfectly captures the whole point of our explainer today. True, unshakable discipline is all about that unseen, grueling effort you put in when literally nobody else is looking. And that brings us to this really fascinating clash during the dialogue. Remember the questioner, Mr. Saito? Well, Hamerton, stepping into that guardian spirit role, knew exactly what Saito had on his schedule. Saito was actually prepping to give a lecture over at a place called Shibuya Shoja. And the working title of this lecture, it was something like, How to Suddenly Become a Genius. Oh man, Hamerton totally uses this moment to give his earthly charge a huge reality check. He basically looks at him and says, look, I know what you're planning to teach, and you need to pump the brakes, because there is no such magic. Boom. No sudden, unearned leap to genius. It's such a stark, honest contrast between how much we want a quick fix today and the ancient, undeniable truth of putting in the work. So, obviously that begs the question, if there's no magic spell, what's the actual roadmap here? Well, Hamerton lays it all out. He says the true path to a brilliant mind is all about ceaseless, deeply unglamorous intellectual discipline. We're talking daily reading, writing, critical thinking. He specifically warns against letting your mind rust. It's like if you read a bunch of great books when you're 18, but then you just stop, your intellect is going to oxidize and fall apart, just like a piece of scrap iron out in the rain. And here's the big pivot in his philosophy. To Hamerton, this isn't just about secular self-help. He argues that this lifelong grind has to be grounded in unwavering faith, a real reverence for the divine, just like Phidias carving for the gods. Faith is that ultimate anchor that keeps you locked in on the long, hard road of continuous learning. All of this builds up to what I think is the most striking warning in the entire dialogue. Hamerton literally tells Saito, if you neglect practice and study, even an angel will become a fallen angel. Just let that sink in for a second. It does not matter how high your spiritual status is, how naturally gifted you are, or what amazing things you did in a past life. If you just rest on your laurels, if you bail on that daily grind of practicing and learning, you are going to fall. It's a really severe warning for sure, but honestly, it's also super empowering because it means your current state is 100% in your own hands based on the effort you choose to put in today. And just like that, we're at the end of our explainer. We've jumped from the golden age of Athens right into the heavy challenges of modern intellectual life. And the main takeaway from the soul of Hamerton and Phidias couldn't be clearer. Drop the illusion of overnight success, period. Instead, fully embrace the quiet, unseen, daily grind. So I want to leave you with this one final provocative question to chew on today. What unseen statue are you going to dedicate yourself to carving today? What intellectual or spiritual heavy lifting are you going to do right now, knowing full well that even if no other human ever sees it, the gods are watching? Thank you so much for joining me on this awesome journey of the mind. Keep learning, keep carving those unseen statues, and I will catch you in the next one. Welcome to today's explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to guide you through this material today. We're going to tackle a core philosophical dilemma that honestly affects every single one of us every single day. We are looking at the profound difference between just gathering information and truly cultivating wisdom. Sounds simple on the surface, right? But as we'll see as we unpack these sources, the distinction between the two is actually the ultimate test of an intellectual life. All right, let's dive right in. I want you to think about your own smartphone habits for a second. In a world of endless, infinite scrolling, how much of what you read, watch, or listen to on a given Tuesday actually matters by Wednesday? It's crazy to think about, but we are just bombarded with this relentless stream of digital content. It's fleeting, it's incredibly fast, and it constantly demands our attention. But is it actually adding any real value to our lives? That is the exact question our source text for today forces us to confront. And that brings us to where our journey begins today. We're looking at a deeply thought-provoking book by Ryuho Okawa, which presents a spiritual message from the 19th century English writer P.G. Hamerton. Now, the message on the cover is striking. It roughly translates to, put down the smartphone, read a book. Talk about a direct challenge to our modern screen-addicted lifestyle, right? The author is basically urging us to actively carve out time from our busy lives, stepping completely away from the internet, our jobs, the daily chores, just to seek out genuine wisdom. Let's move into section 1, the blurring lines, knowledge versus consumption. The source text makes this incredibly sharp observation about our current era. It points out that the fundamental distinction between knowledge and information is practically disappearing. Instead of acquiring lasting knowledge, the kind that actually stays with us and shapes our character, we've shifted toward just dealing with information that is simply consumed. Think about that specific word, consumed. It's kind of like a fast food meal. It totally satisfies a momentary urge, but it doesn't provide any long-term intellectual nourishment whatsoever. It's here today and literally forgotten by tomorrow. So the absolutely crucial point here is understanding this core dichotomy presented in the text, information versus wisdom. On one side of the scale, we've got information. The text defines this as temporary, super tied to the present moment, and essentially meant for rapid-fire consumption. But on the other side, we have wisdom. Wisdom is described as universal, holding this profound, lasting value that totally transcends the immediate moment. It's basically the difference between knowing the weather forecast for today and actually understanding the climate. Let's break down how the author characterizes this modern information just a bit further. According to the text, information is completely tethered to our current digital environment. It is rapidly changing. What's trending in the morning is old news by the afternoon, right? And because of that sheer speed, it is ultimately superficial. It's the daily trivia of our lives. Sure, it feels urgent right now, but it completely lacks the depth required to actually build a meaningful intellectual foundation. Now, in stark contrast, the pursuit of wisdom represents the true essence of an intellectual lifestyle. The text outlines that wisdom is universal, meaning it applies across entirely different eras and situations. And acquiring it, well, it isn't quick. It requires deep reading, intense focus, and a really conscious effort to just step away from all the noise. It's about engaging in the kind of intellectual training and continuous effort that the author argues is absolutely necessary even in fields like art and beauty. It's a deliberate, highly cultivated practice. And here is why this matters specifically today. The author emphasizes that this challenge is uniquely critical for millennials and digital natives, people who have grown up entirely immersed in this digital sea. For a generation raised on superficial data, seeking actual depth and practically learning how to filter this endless stream is vital. The text expects these digital natives to use these deep concepts as a practical theory for both life and work. Which brings us to section 2, the ultimate judgment, when the coffin closes. So at the end of chapter 11, right after Hamerton's spiritual message concludes, Ryuho Okawa expresses this genuine surprise. He's struck by a deep, almost soul-level connection between Hamerton and the questioner, Mr. Saito. And out of this really profound moment comes a very strict reality check. I want to pause on this exact translated quote. The true value of life is judged when the coffin is closed. Wow. When the noise finally stops and our time is up, what is the final judgment of our pursuits? Now, this metaphor isn't meant to be purely morbid. It's an urgent, solemn reminder to cultivate a lasting intellectual legacy. In fact, the author specifically highlights the importance of the editing work being done to share these very messages. Editing isn't just about cutting words. It's a rigorous practice of conveying the true essence of an intellectual life to others. When that coffin closes, you aren't going to be evaluated on the daily trivia you consumed, but on the universal wisdom you cultivated and left behind. Let's look at Section 3, the afterword, surviving the 21st century. In the afterword, the author totally acknowledges that grasping these deep, timeless concepts is actually really difficult for modern people who are so used to fast-paced consumption. However, he introduces a vital path forward here, expressing a strong hope that readers can obtain what he calls a new key. So, what exactly is this new key? Well, the text defines it as the ultimate survival tool for the 21st century. And you acquire this key through one profound realization: truly understanding and internalizing the difference between information, that temporary stuff we just scroll through, and wisdom, the universal value we actually cultivate. Grasping this dichotomy isn't just some academic exercise. The author posits it as literally essential for surviving an era where we are constantly drowning in data overload. Ultimately, the author's stated hope in these closing pages is that this text serves as a pilot, almost like a guide for future society. It's really designed to act as a compass for both life and work, especially for those digital natives we talked about earlier. It teaches us how to balance the relentless pursuit of profound depth with the highly practical skill of knowing exactly what information to just cut loose and ignore. Which brings us to our final thought for today's explainer. Based on everything we've unpacked from these sources, I want to leave you with this. When your coffin ultimately closes, will you be remembered for the fleeting information you mindlessly consumed or the timeless wisdom you intentionally cultivated? It's a pretty heavy question for sure, but it's exactly the kind of deep reflection required to find that new key for the 21st century. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time. Have you ever wrapped up a long day feeling absolutely exhausted, even though literally all you did was stare at a screen? Well, you're definitely not alone. Welcome to this explainer, where we're going to dive into a truly fascinating philosophical guide for finding some much-needed clarity in our incredibly noisy, hyper-connected modern world. We're going to unpack exactly why that digital fatigue happens, and more importantly, how we can actually fix it. So, think about this for a second. Are we drowning in information, yet entirely starving for wisdom? This is kind of the ultimate crisis for digital natives today, right? We're facing endless scrolling, constant digital burnout, and this non-stop barrage of fleeting little facts. I mean, we literally have more data at our fingertips than any other generation in human history. But are we actually gaining any real understanding? It's a huge paradox. We are completely flooded with content, yet our minds often feel completely starved for something that actually matters. Now, the advice we're looking at today starts with a pretty bold, direct challenge right on the cover of Ryuho Okawa's text: put down the smartphone, read a book. What this work does is brilliantly adapt P.G. Hamerton's late Victorian intellectual philosophy, a massive inspiration from over a century ago, into a highly practical survival guide tailored specifically for millennials and the digital generation, trying to navigate all of today's chaos. Section 1. Modern Information Overflow. Let's set the stage and look at the environment we're currently trapped in. The author makes the compelling argument right off the bat. In our current environment, we constantly mistake the cheap, transient facts we consume on our phones for actual, meaningful knowledge. You know the drill. We skim a headline, we swipe through a quick hot take, and we suddenly feel like we've learned something profound. But here's the reality. That kind of information is rapidly consumed and just as easily forgotten. It is literally the intellectual equivalent of fast food. It leaves us totally full but completely unnourished. Section 2. Awakening to Intellectual Life. To understand how to break this cycle, the author shares a personal story in the foreword. Picture this. It's the late 1970s. Japan is in the middle of this massive, rapid economic growth, and a young Ryuho Okawa is spending his own hard-earned pocket money to buy and utterly devour Hamerton's The Intellectual Life. That intense reading experience was a huge catalyst for him. And this isn't just some abstract pie-in-the-sky theory. The book offers incredibly practical tools for preventing mental rust and managing your time, showing us exactly how to keep the mind sharp and stop wasting our precious energy. Section 3. Information versus wisdom. We have to draw a hard line here. We must cleanly separate the endless information that exhausts us from the true wisdom that actually enriches us. Look, information is fleeting and cheap. It's designed to be consumed and immediately discarded. Wisdom? Wisdom is universal. It's deep. As an author who's published over 2,400 books, Okawa emphasizes this as his own theory of intellectual life. True wisdom actually accumulates in the soul. It builds on itself to make you a more grounded, deeply insightful human being. In the afterword, the author actually describes himself as someone who has deliberately trained both the left and right hemispheres of his brain. It's a fully integrated approach. Our modern digital lives constantly demand left brain activity. Logic, data processing, rapidly reacting to notifications. But without intentionally making space for the right brain's intuition and deeper spiritual synthesis, well, we can never really convert all that raw data into lasting wisdom. Section 4, Life's Cutting Off. Okay, so knowing we need wisdom is one thing, but how on earth do we find the time for it? Enter Mikiri. This is an absolute game changer. It translates to a sense of cutting off, and it's the ultimate practical art for any focused learner trying to survive reality today. It essentially means consciously deciding what not to read, what not to watch, and exactly which feeds you need to unsubscribe from immediately, so you aren't leaking your valuable energy on things that simply do not matter. So, how do we actually do this? By aggressively practicing Mikiri, modern professionals can reclaim their time and finally beat burnout. You have to actively choose to step away from useless media and stop wasting time on trivial information. It's about fiercely protecting your attention so you have the mental bandwidth left over to choose that universal, lasting knowledge we talked about. But hang on a second. Is simply reading books and managing your time enough? If we really pause and think about it deeply, just gathering knowledge isn't the final destination here. Being highly efficient and well-read is a fantastic start, for sure. But according to the author's own life experience, there is a much, much higher peak to climb. Section 5. To Contemplative Life. The author reflects on something pretty incredible. His intense intellectual life naturally transitioned and elevated into a profound spiritual life. And he did this without going through any special, formal religious training. Borrowing a concept from the political philosopher Hannah Arendt, this is known as the contemplative life. It's a heightened, meditative state where pure intellectual effort elevates your entire existence and opens what he calls the eye of wisdom. You literally begin to view your life and society as a whole through a much higher, crystal clear lens. Section 6, 21st Century's Survival Key. Let's bring this all together. By combining that deep pursuit of truth with the everyday practical art of Mikiri, this philosophy becomes a vital navigational compass for modern work, life, and finding real meaning. Now, Okawa admits that reading late Victorian texts like Hamerton's original work isn't exactly easy for people today, with a constant flood of modern information. But if you can grasp that crucial difference between cheap data and true wisdom, and if you can apply the discipline to cut out the noise, you unlock a powerful new key to not just surviving, but truly thriving in the 21st century. So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on the next time you instinctively reach for your smartphone. You have a choice in how you feed your mind. Will it be the fleeting, trivial noise that leaves you totally exhausted? Or will you actively choose the lasting wisdom that elevates your entire life? The power to cut off the noise is completely in your hands. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today.